The alien princess thought he was just a servant. Now she can't stop thinking about him. He stood at the edge of the hallway, motionless as guards rushed past, footsteps echoing against the crystalline walls. Lights pulsed in faint red, an alarm that signaled breach. He showed no sign of fear or hesitation. His dark eyes, set beneath a brow creased with experience, flickered once at the distant corridor, then settled on the sealed doors at his left. A hiss of pressurized air drifted from behind those ornate doors, suggesting someone or something was trapped inside. He tilted his head, just a fraction, listening intently to the quiet, measuring whether it was safe. His broad shoulders were tense, every muscle primed for combat, but he did not move yet. Beneath the standard issue vest, a heartbeat pounded with adrenaline, though his face revealed nothing. In that stillness, a presence on the other side of the door seemed to match his energy, an unspoken awareness passing through the barrier. He placed his palm against the shimmering surface, feeling it vibrate with the hum of alien technology. For a moment he breathed, letting the tension build, letting the weight of the palace's collapse press upon his lungs. Then with a single, powerful motion, he pressed the release switch. "You will release me, human! If you kneel now, I may let you live." Dane didn't answer. He simply stared. Illuminated by flickering emergency lights stood an alien woman, her wrists manacled with energy restraints. Her bearing was regal in every inch of her stance. She seemed more affronted by the indignity of capture than fearful of its consequences. A faint shimmer passed across her skin, accentuating the lithe, muscled frame beneath an ornate gown torn along one side. She was as tall as he was, her eyes reflecting a cold brilliance that put the palace crystals to shame. He allowed the silence to stretch. He noticed how her chest rose and fell with carefully constrained fury, how the color of her exposed forearms shifted in subtle patterns, suggesting heat and adrenaline. Finally, he smiled, just enough to challenge. The smirk was a slash of irreverence, but no words came yet from him. Outside in the corridor, voices shouted instructions for a retreat. The palace was falling. Something in his expression must have told her that he was no ordinary servant. When he stepped closer, she squared her shoulders. "You dare defy me?" she said, voice thrumming through the air. Each syllable hummed with a pitch that sent a light jolt through his nerves. "Human, I will tear this place apart if I must." He reached up and deactivated the restraints at her wrists. A red glow on the clasp vanished, and the metal cuffs clattered to the floor. She rubbed her wrists, but did not break eye contact. She had expected a retinue of guards, weapons pointed, demands barked at her. Instead, she faced a single man, his stance calm and sure. "I see you're no servant," she murmured, voice still thick with disdain. "You think helping me now will earn mercy later?" A faint tremor rocked the hallway, overhead beams showering sparks as systems malfunctioned. Dane finally spoke, each syllable like steel. "I think you should save your threats." He gestured for her to follow. "And try keeping up." They moved down the corridor together, though she bristled with offense at the idea of taking commands from him. When they stepped through the shattered archway, they found the palace interior in chaos. Zyra, Princess Zyra of the House of Lusser, caught sight of her own palace guard pinned under fallen debris, and she hissed at the man who'd freed her. "Stop! I command you to lift that beam. You will." He was already moving, ignoring her words, but doing what she demanded nonetheless. With a grunt of effort, he wedged his shoulder under the collapsing support and heaved. The soldier gasped for breath and stared wide-eyed at Dane's strength. The princess knelt, her skin rippling with color, and helped the guard to his feet. There was no question she valued her people, yet she wasn't ready to show gratitude to a human who had, moments ago, seemed like an enemy. Her scorn was nearly tangible. Moving swiftly, they navigated the palace corridors. Twisted remains of decorative pillars littered the floor. Exposed wires crackled. Occasional blasts rocked the entire structure, threatening to collapse it from within. The only reason Zyra hadn't yet abandoned the place was clear. She was the princess of this empire, and if there was a chance to reclaim her stronghold, she'd do it. Meanwhile, Dane's eyes were sharp, scanning corners and passageways. There was lethal purpose in his measured steps, but no subservience. Nothing about him said servant, or lackey. He seemed more like a predator unleashed. You have a name, she finally snapped, stepping over debris in a swirl of shredded silks. Answer me. He paused, gave her another smirk. Dane. Dane. She let the syllable roll off her tongue, gaze narrowing. You are no soldier of my father's. You're not wearing the crest. They marched past an open courtyard where distant blasts lit the sky. Her question hung in the air. He didn't volunteer more. Instead, he lifted a scorched piece of the palace tapestry out of her path, as though unobtrusively offering her a safe step. She refused to be impressed, or at least she tried. That single moment of consideration, even couched in thick tension, felt strangely jarring. Then he was back to scanning the area, cold gaze unwavering. At the next corridor, a group of insurgents wielding energy weapons converged. Without hesitation, Dane launched forward, an explosive burst of motion that took them by surprise. One assassin fired, but the beam went wide, searing a molten line along the wall. Twisting away, Dane caught the assassin's wrist, wrenched it at an angle that forced him to drop the weapon. The speed of Dane's movements was almost inhuman. Lethal training, no wasted motion. He slammed the heel of his palm into an attacker's jaw, then pivoted to throw a second into the wall with bone-jarring force. Zyra watched, eyes narrowed, but she didn't stay idle. Her slender fingers curled around a fallen guard's blaster, and she fired 3 staccato shots, each landing with mechanical precision. She didn't even flinch. The last insurgent collapsed, stunned by the barrage of pulses. In the sudden hush, smoke and ozone clung to the air. Dane exhaled, stepping over the unconscious forms. We don't have much time. She turned her eyes on him, glittering with a pride that refused to be overshadowed by the near-death fight. The only reason I'm following you is because I need to find my father and the Royal Council. If you're lying about your loyalties... He glanced at her, a flicker of contempt crossing his features. I have my own reasons to keep you alive. They stalked onward, forced into a tense alliance by the palace's imminent collapse and the rogue insurgents. At no point did they let their guard down. Sparks crackled overhead, and alarms blared from every direction. The princess, accustomed to commanding an army, found herself following the lead of one who moved like a ghost through the carnage. Her mind churned. He was human, but not one of her servants. He'd been inside the palace, presumably under disguise, or perhaps infiltrating. She realized with growing suspicion that he must have anticipated this coup, or had some hand in it. Yet here he was, saving her life, defying her commands, and making her rely on him in a way she despised. The tension between them was a coiled serpent, lethal and potent. At the far end of the corridor, they discovered a locked emergency hatch. The console flickered. Zyra pushed forward, her proximity to the panel making it hum in response to her biological signature, alien technology keyed to the royal bloodline. She tried to override the lock, but the system refused to comply, glitching as if sabotaged. With a frustrated hiss, she pressed her palm to the scanning plate, her skin shimmering with faint pulses of color. Dane stood behind her close enough that she felt the warmth radiating from his body. He was silent. She hated that his presence felt steady. She'd expected a lesser being. Even a member of her father's legendary guard might have trembled under her gaze, and yet this human faced her with a cold, unwavering stare. She felt tested, challenged in a way that was both infuriating and electric. Without warning, the overhead lights snapped off, plunging the corridor into darkness. The palace's core system must have failed. Only emergency beacons along the floor remained, pulsing in faint intervals. Somewhere behind them, a portion of the ceiling crashed, sending tremors through the floor. Zyra's heart hammered. Adrenaline coursed through her. She bit down a curse. The lock refused to yield. We need to get through this hatch, she muttered, pressing at the panel again. She glanced over her shoulder, sensing Dane's presence behind her, silhouette stark against the flickering lights. Can you force it open? He stepped forward, ignoring the swirl of her torn gown that brushed against his hip. His gloved hands found the edges of the hatch. He tested the metal, then set his stance. From the corner of her eye, Zyra observed him with grudging respect. She saw the raw power in the way muscles corded in his arms, the veins standing out along his forearms. His expression was locked in grim determination. Her breath caught, though she quickly swallowed that reaction. She didn't want to show even a flicker of admiration. A groan of protesting steel cut through the corridor. Then, slowly, the hatch gave under his onslaught. With a final burst of effort, he pried it open, revealing a small utility passage. They could hear the sound of explosions outside. The entire palace was in danger of a catastrophic collapse. Zyra wasted no time, stepping inside the cramped corridor with a regal tilt of her chin that belied the storm of emotions beneath. Dane followed, the door sealing behind them. There was barely room to move. The air was stale, tinged with the metallic tang of machinery. Behind them, the corridor they'd left crumbled in on itself. They had mere moments to navigate the utility shaft. Zyra led, albeit grudgingly, because she knew the route. Dane remained at her heels, scanning for threats. The forced proximity didn't go unnoticed by either. Each shift of their bodies brushed them together. Her heightened senses detected the steady cadence of his breath, the heat that radiated from his skin. She clenched her jaw, focusing on the path. But there was a faint catch in her own breath. He spoke softly behind her. "Where does this lead?" She answered without looking back. "A secret escape route. My father had it installed to evacuate high-ranking officials in case of siege." She swallowed her frustration. "I never thought we'd actually use it." A ragged edge crept into her voice. She pressed on, ignoring the ache in her legs. He had no choice but to follow, the claustrophobic walls forcing him near enough that his body heat collided with hers in the narrow space. For what felt like an eternity, they climbed and twisted through the labyrinth of service tunnels, each step a small war with their own pride. She would never admit she needed him, but she paused occasionally to let him pry open jammed panels or haul aside collapsed debris. Each time, she watched him with that measuring, predatory gaze, as though she were still deciding whether to kill him once this was over. Eventually, they emerged into a ravaged landing bay. High above, the dome had cracked, open to the star-laced sky. Wind whipped at the edges of scattered crates, carrying smoke and dust. Flames raged along one side of the bay, and overhead turrets beeped in broken attempts at security. Dane crouched behind a pile of crates, pulling Zyra with him when an energy cannon across the bay discharged with a thunderous roar. She wrenched her arm away, her regal composure returning. "I will not hide," she hissed, though she remained behind the crates for cover. His eyes flicked to the cannon. "I don't care what you do, princess. But if you want to live, keep your head down." She bristled at his tone, that note of confident, almost mocking disregard. Part of her wanted to punish him for it, but survival came first. Together, they observed the far end of the bay, where a faction of insurgents rallied around the smoldering remains of a vessel. Through the haze, she recognized the insignia of a rival house, one that had always coveted the throne. The revelation tightened a coil of anger in her gut. "We need an aircraft," Dane said. He was scanning for something space-worthy. Zyra's eyes settled on a sleek, half-damaged royal cruiser near the outer blast doors. "That is my father's personal ship." He nodded. "Then we take it." She opened her mouth to retort, but he was already moving, an extension of unstoppable momentum. They sprinted across the open space, weaving through piles of rubble. An explosion rocked them from behind, sending shards of metal into the air. Zyra stumbled but caught herself. Dane slowed just enough to place a steadying hand on her elbow, then withdrew it as if the contact were inconsequential. She set her jaw, refusing to dwell on how his hand felt. Near the cruiser's ramp, two armed figures stood guard. They were barking into comm devices, scanning for intruders. Zyra ducked behind a twisted support beam, while Dane circled wide, silent as a predator. She watched him vanish behind smoke, tension electrifying her pulse. She expected to hear gunfire or shouting, but there was only a muffled scuffle. Moments later, Dane reappeared, beckoning her forward. The guards lay motionless, and a cold purpose shone in his eyes. They hurried up the ramp. The inside of the ship flickered with emergency power. Panels beeped irregularly. She jumped into the pilot's seat, launching into a flurry of controls. "This craft responds to royal blood only," she muttered, pressing her palm to a biometric sensor. He lingered behind her, his presence large, waiting. She felt that quiet tension again, the sense of being both protected and threatened by him. With a series of chimes, the cruiser's engines came to life, though they sputtered in protest. She grit her teeth, cursing under her breath. Systems were damaged. The thrusters would only manage a short flight. She realized with an icy drop in her stomach that they might not get far. "Strap in," she commanded. He took the co-pilot's seat, ignoring the battered harness. She fired the thrusters. The entire ship shook, moaning as it lifted off the cracked deck. Outside, the insurgents realized what was happening. Blaster fire pinged off the hull. A direct hit to the left thruster set off an alarm. Zyra grimaced, forcing the ship into a haphazard ascent. They cleared the dome just as part of the roof collapsed behind them in a deafening roar. Below, the palace's main spire caved in on itself in a swirl of molten debris. Zyra felt a wrenching fury, seeing her home in ruins. As they climbed, the ship's controls flickered with warnings, the flight stabilizer failing. Zyra wrestled with the joystick, but the craft yawed violently. It wasn't space-worthy, she could feel it. The best she could do was steer them away from the burning palace, out into the open plains that spread beyond the city. If they managed to land, if the thrusters held, it would be in hostile territory with no backup. The ground rushed up too fast. She engaged the crash foam system, unleashing a cascade of inert foam into the cabin. The cruiser slammed onto the plains in a gut-churning impact that tore up the soil for hundreds of meters, finally grinding to a halt with a tortured squeal of metal. Smoke and sparks filled the cockpit. Emergency lights blinked as the engines shut down. The world became a cacophony of alarms and the acrid stench of burned wiring. For a breath, neither moved. Then Zyra coughed, tasting blood in her mouth. She felt shards of glass from the console biting into her forearms. She lifted her gaze to find Dane already forcing the cockpit door open. Wind rushed in, clearing the smoke. He turned to her, eyes flicking over her form, as if checking for serious injuries. She tried to stand, but her leg buckled. Searing pain lanced up her calf. He caught her under the arms before she fell. She gritted her teeth. "I'm fine." He didn't waste time on words. He hoisted her arm around his shoulder. Together they stumbled out of the ruined ship onto the plains, a rolling landscape of tall, shimmering grasses that danced in the alien moonlight. Distant fires marked the horizon where the palace once stood. Overhead, the sky churned with black smoke and swirling ashes. No immediate sign of pursuit, but it wouldn't be long. Not after that crash. They both knew it. She shrugged off his support as soon as she could stand. Pain flared, but she clenched her jaw, refusing to show weakness. Dane surveyed the damage. The ship's hull was twisted beyond repair, one wing sheared off entirely. They might find supplies inside if the cargo hold remained intact. He motioned for her to stay put, then ducked inside again. She watched him go, heart pounding with residual adrenaline and anger. This was all wrong. She was Zyra, princess of House Lusser, heir to a mighty empire. Yet here she was, fleeing for her life with a human whose loyalties were questionable at best. Her chest tightened with a mixture of rage and something else. Something that lingered in the space between them when he steadied her. It made her uneasy. He emerged from the wreck, lugging 2 packs. His face was streaked with soot, but his expression remained carved from stone. "There's enough rations for a few days. Some medical supplies." He eyed her leg. She tried not to flinch. "Sit." "I will stand." His gaze turned cold, or maybe it was concern masked as impatience. She couldn't tell. "Sit before you bleed out," he growled. Then, in a sudden motion, he gripped her shoulder, guided her firmly down to rest against a piece of twisted hull. She hissed a protest, but lacked the energy to resist. Her leg was throbbing. He knelt, rummaging through one of the packs and pulling out a med spray. She watched him with an unreadable expression, silent as he worked. His hands were surprisingly gentle, though his face stayed impassive. He cut away the shredded fabric to reveal a jagged wound. She hissed as the antiseptic stung, but he didn't pause. He applied a coagulant gel, sealed it with quick precision, then wrapped a bandage around her calf. When he was done, he stood, gaze sweeping their surroundings as though the intimacy of that brief moment meant nothing. "You're my captive, in case you've forgotten," she snapped, still defiant. "When my father's armies find us, you will." "Your father's palace is burning," he replied evenly. "I doubt his armies are in any position to help." He hoisted the packs. "We should move. This area is too exposed." She inhaled sharply, eyes flashing. She despised the logic in his words. Despised more how a small part of her was grateful that he was capable, that he was here to keep her alive, if only so she could reclaim her empire. With a huff, she pushed herself to standing. The bandage ached, but the med spray did its job, and the bleeding stopped. She limped after him, cursing under her breath with every step. For hours they trudged across the plains under the eerie half-light of a fractured sky. Smoke still clouded the horizon. Occasionally, a distant rumble echoed, hinting at battles continuing across the city. Zyra walked in tense silence, refusing to engage in idle conversation. Dane's pace was measured to accommodate her injury, but he never commented on it. The tall grasses rustled around them, their silvery stalks reflecting starlight. She felt like an exile in her own land, crossing a sea of shimmering blades that hissed accusations at her. Eventually, they found a small outcropping of rock, a natural ridge that provided some shelter from the wind. They set up a makeshift camp. Dane started a contained heat flame for warmth, an advanced survival device from the pack. He offered Zyra a ration bar, which she took wordlessly, more hunger in her eyes than she'd care to admit. The air chilled fast at night. She shivered, though she tried to hide it, drawing the remains of her shredded gown around her shoulders. He watched her from across the small circle of light, his gaze unreadable. She felt the heat of his stare, almost as tangible as the flame. She didn't look away. In that silence, an unspoken battle of wills sparked. She was used to commanding. He was used to defying. She wanted to demand answers, but something about his composure made her cautious. Still, she had too many questions to remain silent. "You were in my palace," she said, breaking the hush. "Who are you really?" He was silent for a beat, then answered. "I was a soldier in the outer colonies. My unit was taken out by your father's forces." His tone was controlled, each word chosen carefully. "After that, I worked my way here to finish what was started." She felt a spark of anger. "You blame my father for your war?" The colonies rose against him. "You should know better than to cross the empire." He gave a short, harsh laugh. "Your empire does as it pleases. And so do I." Her eyes narrowed at his audacity. She glanced down at the faint shimmering across her own skin, betraying her tension. She clenched her fists until her knuckles whitened, then forced herself to relax. "So you infiltrated my palace. For what? Revenge? Assassination?" He considered. "Possibly." She took a breath, her voice low and dangerous. "Then why help me escape?" His gaze flicked to hers, and in the flicker of flame, she saw something darker there, something that mirrored the anger she felt. "I have my reasons." She wanted to press further, but the fury in his eyes matched her own. It surprised her that a human could harbor such a storm. In the end, she gave a regal tilt of her head. "Your reasons mean nothing. You may think you have the upper hand, but once I regain control..." He cut in. "Control is a fragile thing, princess." He rose to his feet, adjusting the heat device. "For now, get some rest. Tomorrow, we find a way off this planet or back to your city. Whichever keeps us alive." She nearly sprang to her feet, outraged by his dismissive tone, but the pulsing ache in her leg and the bone-deep exhaustion tempered her reaction. With a last glare, she turned her back on him and settled on a patch of ground. She would not sleep, not deeply. But her body demanded some reprieve, even in the presence of this infuriating human. The flickering light danced across her closed eyelids. She refused to let herself trust him. She refused to let him see any sign of vulnerability. Yet as she drifted on the edge of consciousness, her mind betrayed her, conjuring images of his powerful form, that unwavering stare, the way he'd fought to protect her, even if his motives were twisted. Sleep came in fits, nightmares of a burning palace and betrayal. Each time she startled awake, she saw him on the other side of the fire, sitting with his back against a rock, arms folded. He was watching the horizon. Occasionally, he'd glance in her direction. She'd pretend not to notice, shutting her eyes again. In the hush of the plains, the tension between them hummed like a live wire, waiting for a spark. When dawn came, its pale light revealing the devastation in the distance, they rose without speaking. Dane gave her a canteen, and she drank, eyes fixed on him, searching for the slightest sign of weakness or deceit. He remained inscrutable. She wanted to hate him. She wanted to conquer him. And she loathed that part of her recognized an odd kinship in his defiance. They set out again, determined to stay one step ahead of any pursuers. The plains gradually sloped into a rocky plateau. The ground grew jagged, dotted with strange flora that twisted up from crevices. She recognized this region, a neutral territory on the outskirts of her domain, rarely patrolled and rumored to harbor mercenaries. A dangerous place, but with potential resources? If they could locate an old outpost, they might find a communicator or transportation. That meant forging an uneasy truce with Dane. For now. Hours passed in tense silence, broken only by the sound of their steps and the wind moaning through stone pillars. Her leg flared with pain at intervals, but she forced herself forward, refusing to ask for help. Occasionally, Dane paused, scanning the sky for any sign of air patrols or drop ships. None appeared. She wondered if the insurgents were too busy consolidating power in the city to chase down the last surviving royal. The thought made her blood boil. She refused to believe her empire had fallen so easily. At midday, they stopped for a brief rest in the shadow of a towering rock formation. Zyra sank down, biting back a grimace. Dane stood a few paces away, rummaging through the supply pack. He retrieved a small device shaped like a tuning fork. She recognized it as a scanning probe, likely stolen or salvaged from the palace. He swept it in slow arcs, monitoring signals. She watched with narrowed eyes, wondering what frequency he was hoping to detect. He caught her gaze. "We need a read on any local comm signals. Your father's forces, insurgents, mercenaries, anyone with a ship." Her pride flared, but she couldn't disagree with the logic. She forced herself to look away, refusing to express gratitude. The device crackled with static, no clear signals. He frowned, adjusting dials. She realized he might not fully understand the intricacies of Imperial tech. Rising to her feet, she stepped closer, ignoring the twinge in her calf. "Give it to me," she ordered. He hesitated, a glint of challenge in his dark eyes. Then, slowly, he handed it over. She manipulated the controls, cycling through coded frequencies known only to the palace. Static hissed. The wind gusted around them. Finally, a faint beep. A ghost of a transmission. She locked onto it, amplifying. Broken words filtered through the device in the alien tongue of her people. She caught phrases like, "Allies scattered, regroup, hidden," and then the signal died. Her heart leapt. Some of my father's advisors must still be alive. They're hidden somewhere, broadcasting on low frequencies. Dane's expression tightened. She recognized that look. It was the expression of a man whose vendetta might be complicated by the princess's potential allies. But he said nothing. She set the probe to search mode, hoping to recapture the signal. After a few moments, no further transmissions were found. She tensed. "The signal is weak," she said quietly, more to herself than to him. "We have to get closer." He nodded, scanning the horizon. "Then we keep moving." Without further debate, they pressed on. The rocky terrain grew more treacherous, each step a risk for a twisted ankle or a sudden drop. They picked their way across jagged outcrops, avoiding deep fissures. A dust storm threatened on the horizon, swirling in ominous clouds. By mid-afternoon, the wind whipped at their clothes and stung their eyes. Zaira's skin reacted to the temperature changes, faint pulses of color betraying her discomfort. She cursed under her breath, focusing on each step with determination. Dane halted abruptly, raising a hand. She froze. He pointed to a line of scuffed footprints in the dust, leading around a large boulder. They approached cautiously, each muscle tensed for a fight. Rounding the boulder, they found the entrance to a hidden bunker, half buried by debris. A battered symbol on the door told Zaira it belonged to an old research station from her father's era. She tested the panel. Dead. No power. Dane checked the seams, found a hinge rusted from time. With combined effort, they forced the door open, scraping aside rubble until there was enough space to squeeze through. Inside, darkness pressed in. The air was stale, heavy with disuse. They activated small glow sticks from the pack, casting wavering greenish light on metal corridors lined with dusty consoles. Cautiously, they explored. The station seemed abandoned. Broken furniture, scattered data tablets. A lingering sense of emptiness haunted the place. Still, it was shelter from the storm that was now raging outside. Wind howled, dust pelting the bunker's exterior. Dane found a small control room, its monitors cracked. He fiddled with a backup generator, but it sparked and died. Zaira paced, ignoring the pain in her leg, her nerves on edge. "You might as well rest," he said, not looking at her. "We'll wait out the storm." She gave him a withering glare. "Don't presume to tell me what to do." He shrugged, crouching to examine a console. She stalked away, refusing to let him see the tremor that passed through her. The swirling tension in the station was almost worse than being out in the open. In the flickering glow, with the storm sealing them in, she was forced to confront the reality of his presence. The hard planes of his face, the steady efficiency with which he moved, the way he seemed neither intimidated nor awed by her rank. It scraped at her pride, but a darker part of her felt drawn to that defiance. She tried to occupy herself by examining old data tablets. Most were corrupted. The occasional flicker of text revealed references to biological experiments, though nothing too revealing. She tossed them aside, frustrated. The storm raged on. Hours passed, the sky outside darkening to near black. She realized they would have to spend the night here. Dane eventually joined her, having exhausted his attempts at powering the station. He set the heat device in the corner and placed a small light orb overhead. They established a crude living area in the control room, scattering debris and clearing space. Zaira refused to sit on the floor like some low-born soldier. She perched on a piece of machinery, arms folded. He was across from her, rummaging for anything useful. A tension crackled between them, thickening with every minute. Part of her wanted to break the silence, to demand he explain himself, but she sensed any such conversation would quickly spiral into confrontation. At last he turned toward her, setting aside the last of the salvage. "No luck," he said, indicating the station's systems. "We're stuck until the storm passes. Possibly longer, if we can't find a ride out of here." Her jaw clenched. "I've noticed, human." He exhaled a short breath, as if stifling annoyance. Then, in a move that startled her, he walked closer, his posture emanating a quiet challenge. She held her ground, refusing to flinch, even though the proximity made her heart pound uncomfortably. She could see every line of tension in his jaw, the faint streaks of dust across his face, the way his eyes pinned her with a look that dared her to speak. She realized he was doing the same, studying her features, her wounds, the rhythmic shift of color over her alien skin. In the tight space between them, her voice dropped to a near whisper. "You want something from me. Why else save my life when you could have let your enemies do the work?" His lips curved in that half-smile that infuriated her. "I'd rather get my revenge directly." She stiffened. "You think killing me will avenge your fallen unit?" She let out a bitter laugh. You overestimate my father's concern. He lifted a shoulder, an ambiguous gesture. There are other ways to strike back at your empire. We'll see which proves most effective. And you think I'll just let you? A muscle in his cheek twitched. He held her gaze, an unspoken current of animosity pulsing between them. She sensed the clash of wills, felt the coil of tension that was neither purely hatred nor purely desire. It was something volatile, a brew of anger, defiance, fascination. It made her acutely aware of the closeness of his body, the faint scent of sweat, and the plane's dust. Time seemed to slow as they stared each other down. She fought the urge to react, to step back or strike him. He wasn't moving away either. The moment stretched dangerously, as if either might lash out or yield to an impulse they both refused to name. Finally, she broke eye contact with a flick of her gaze, stepping aside to create distance. He exhaled, and in that quiet breath, she heard tensions slipping. Her pulse hammered. She cursed herself for letting him get under her skin. She was furious, not just with him but with herself for feeling anything other than contempt. For a moment, she sensed his frustration matching her own, a shared war they fought internally. Then he turned away, moving to the far side of the console. They sank into a prickly silence that lasted until exhaustion forced them to rest. The next morning, the storm died down. The air still smelled of dust, but the wind had eased. Sunlight filtered through the bunker's cracks, revealing heaps of sand piled against the walls. Zyra and Dane emerged from the station, carefully looking for any sign of trouble. The landscape was transformed, dunes reshaped by the tempest. An eerie calm lay over the plains. They resumed their trek with mechanical efficiency. He offered her an arm when the terrain became difficult, but she brushed him off. Each time, she caught a flicker of something in his expression, but he never pressed the matter. Midday brought searing heat that bore down on them. Her skin shimmered, trying to regulate her internal temperature, and she saw the sweat streaming down his neck. Still, he marched forward, unwavering. It was near dusk when they spotted activity in the distance, a small settlement or encampment nestled at the base of rocky cliffs. Smoke trailed from chimneys. Hoverbikes circled around, kicking up dust. Zyra recognized them as mercenary vehicles, likely a lawless band operating outside her father's domain. Dane crouched, and she did the same, observing from a safe distance. They exchanged a look. Any approach would be risky, but it might be their only chance to secure a ship or a communicator. They inched closer, careful to remain unseen. From behind a ridge, they could see a ramshackle collection of prefab huts, old cargo containers, and stolen Imperial gear. Armed guards meandered, some openly bickering or laughing. This was a den of smugglers, thieves, and possibly killers. Zyra's lip curled in disgust. She had once viewed such riffraff as beneath her notice. Now, she relied on them for possible salvation. "How do you want to play this?" Dane murmured, voice low. Her instincts told her to storm in, demand a ship under threat of her royal wrath. But she had to accept reality. Her authority here was meaningless. If she exposed herself, they might sell her to the highest bidder or use her as a bargaining chip against the Empire. She swallowed her pride. "We go in quietly. Look for a vessel. If we find one, we steal it." He gave a curt nod, seeming almost amused by her plan. "Let's hope you can pilot it without your fancy biometric systems." She bristled, but let the comment pass. They waited until nightfall, when the mercenaries' activity calmed. Under the cover of darkness, they slipped into the settlement, weaving between shadows. Zyra's pulse hammered, and she felt an unwanted thrill of danger surging through her veins. They were outnumbered tenfold. One misstep could be fatal. Dane stayed close, his presence a tangible shield in the gloom. Near the settlement's edge, they found a landing area with a few battered ships. A two-seater scout craft caught their eye, small and nimble enough to escape unnoticed. But it was guarded by a lone figure smoking near a crate. They hid behind some debris, assessing the guard's routine. Zyra's skin flushed a faint pink as her body responded to the tension, heart pounding. "I'll draw him away," Dane whispered. She grabbed his wrist. "If you make a sound, the others will converge." He studied her with that unreadable look. Then I won't make a sound. There was something quietly terrifying in his promise, a lethal edge that made her mouth go dry. Before she could protest, he slipped away, circling wide. She watched anxiously, hands flexing at her sides. From her vantage, she saw him appear behind the guard, silent as a wraith. There was a sudden scuffle, a muffled yelp, and the guards slumped. Dane dragged the unconscious body behind the crates, then motioned for her to approach. She hurried over, pulse in her throat. He was already examining the scout craft's exterior. The ramp was down, so they boarded. Inside, a faint chemical odor indicated questionable maintenance. The controls looked standard enough, nothing that screamed advanced Imperial tech. Zyra slid into the pilot's seat, scanning the console. She flicked a few switches. Lights blinked in protest, but the system started to hum. Dane took the co-pilot's seat, shutting the ramp behind them. The engines sputtered. She coaxed them carefully. Outside, she heard distant voices. Possibly the guard's allies realizing something was off. Sweat beaded on her temple. With a final shudder, the craft lifted off the ground, lurching upward in an uneven ascent. Shouts erupted below, and a few stray blaster bolts pinged against the hull. She pressed the throttle forward. The scout ship accelerated, clearing the settlement before any heavier artillery could be deployed. They soared into the night sky, leaving the mercenary camp behind. Dane exhaled. She realized she'd been holding her breath. The instruments were rudimentary, but they had enough fuel for a short journey. The question was, where would they go? The palace was in ruins, the city likely under insurgent control. Her father's fate was unknown. A grim silence settled over them. She guided the ship east, scanning for signs of life or transmissions. Eventually, she found a faint reading on the NAV system, something that looked like a large outpost or city. She steered toward it, while Dane watched the sensors. She could feel the weight of his gaze, though he tried to appear focused on the display. "We'll find out who's in control there," she muttered. "If it's the insurgents, we'll adapt." He gave a single nod. They continued in charged silence, the hum of the engines their only companion. Despite everything, the treachery, the near-fatal escape, the uncertain future, she felt an undercurrent of awareness between them. This man, so calm, so controlled, could have killed her a dozen times, yet here he was, working beside her to survive. It was infuriating, fascinating, and it sent a flicker of heat through her veins that she refused to acknowledge. As they flew, the adrenaline slowly ebbed. The day's exhaustion settled into her bones. She set the autopilot on a preliminary course and leaned back, rubbing her eyes. Across the narrow cockpit, Dane observed her, arms folded. She sensed something akin to curiosity behind his stony mask. She refused to let that unnerve her. When she spoke, her tone was subdued. "If the Empire is truly lost, then you've already won, haven't you? You avenged your unit. There's nothing left for you to do." He was quiet for a long time, as though weighing whether to answer. At last, in a low voice, he said, "Vengeance doesn't always feel like victory." She studied him, surprised by the hint of weariness in his words. It was the closest thing to vulnerability she'd heard from him. But true to the unspoken rule between them, she did not pry further, nor did he elaborate. The hum of the engines droned on, carrying them deeper into a night that offered no guarantee of safety. They approached the outpost just before dawn. It was a sprawling industrial site on the edge of a deep canyon. Smoke curled from tall smokestacks, lights blinked along cargo bays. The place looked operational, though battered. They circled once, scanning the area for signs of heavy defenses. The sensors picked up minor artillery, but nothing that could swat them out of the sky with impunity. She chose a landing spot behind a bluff. Setting down carefully, they powered down to avoid detection. After disembarking, they stashed the ship behind an outcropping, covering it with loose netting they found on board. Daylight crept over the horizon, revealing a dusty industrial complex below. Zyra and Dane moved quietly, picking their way across the rocky ground. She felt a spark of determination. She was done fleeing. If her empire still had a chance, she intended to claim it. And if it had fallen, she would rebuild it, somehow. Dane, equally intent, surveyed the outpost. We'll gather intel. Find out who controls it, whether they're loyal to your father or the insurgents. And if none are loyal? She asked, her voice cold. He gave a faint shrug. Then we do what we must to survive. She resisted the urge to roll her eyes. His stoic approach grated on her. Yet, ironically, it also steadied her nerves. She felt strangely alive, heart pounding in the thrill of infiltration. She was heir to an empire, yet now she walked in the shadows like a renegade. At her side was a man who might well be her executioner, or perhaps her savior. The tension between them simmered, fed by the nearness of their bodies, the forced reliance, and that intangible current of attraction she refused to name. Slipping closer to the compound, they spotted cargo haulers and automated drones. Workers shuffled in and out of large gates, supervised by armed guards wearing a patch that bore no royal insignia. This outpost was under the control of a warlord or some opportunistic faction capitalizing on the Empire's chaos. They'd have to be careful. The question was how to enter without drawing suspicion. Zyra tugged a dark hooded cloak around her shoulders, found in the scout craft's storage. It hid her distinctive attire and the swirling colors of her skin. Dane donned a similar cloak. Together, they joined a queue of laborers entering the main gate. She kept her head low, letting the hustle and bustle swallow them. Dane played the part of a silent escort, carrying a small crate they'd picked up from the ship. She pressed her lips together, ignoring the pang of indignity at passing herself off as a lowly worker. Their ruse held, at least at first glance. Inside, the outpost bustled with activity. Machinery clanked, crates were stacked high, and vehicles came and went along dusty roads. They navigated the maze of scaffolding and cargo depots, searching for a vantage point or a clue about who was in charge. Eventually, they spotted a central office, raised on stilts, with tinted windows overlooking the yard. Guards patrolled the ramp leading up to it. A prime location for gleaning intelligence. They slipped into a side corridor that led behind the office structure. Through an open vent, they heard a conversation in clipped tones. A man with a gravelly voice, likely the outpost commander, spoke of shipments bound for the capital, which was finally under new management. Zyra's pulse raced at the mention of the capital. Her home. She inched closer to the vent, straining to hear. The princess is said to be alive, the gravelly voice said. They're offering a bounty for her capture. A fortune that could fund our operations for years. She felt Dane go rigid beside her. The voice continued. If any of you spot her or hear rumors, you come to me first. We deliver her to the insurgent council, and we get paid double. Zyra's hands clenched into fists. The idea of being reduced to a bounty was abhorrent. She glanced at Dane, expecting to see a flicker of triumph. After all, capturing her was once his goal, wasn't it? But his face was unreadable, tension coiled behind his eyes. She thought she saw a spark of conflict, but it vanished. They backed away from the vent. She turned to him, voice low. We need to find a secure comm station. We have to contact whoever remains loyal in the Empire. If they've consolidated in the capital, we need to know. He nodded, scanning for possible routes. They spotted a communication tower near the far end of the compound, guarded by a pair of mercenaries. The structure rose above the complex, crowned by antennas and satellite dishes. A fortress of steel. Reaching it would be challenging, but it might be their best shot at sending a coded distress signal. They skirted the perimeter of the yard, staying hidden between shipping containers and cargo loaders. A cacophony of horns and mechanical clatter masked their footsteps. The tower loomed ahead, the guards posted at a single entrance. The question was how to get past them without raising the alarm. Zyra watched the guards closely, noting their patterns. One occasionally stepped away to check crates. The other lingered by the door. She breathed deeply, mind racing. Then she made a decision. She stood, adjusting the hood around her hair, and walked out from behind the crates with steady confidence. Dane reached to stop her, but she shook him off. If she had to rely on subtlety, so be it. She approached the guards with purposeful strides. "Halt!" barked one of them. "What are you doing here?" She raised her hands in a placating gesture, voice lowered to disguise her accent. My manager sent me to retrieve a part from the comm station. Something for the transmitter. I'm just doing my job." The guard eyed her suspiciously. She felt her heartbeat thunder, but kept her face neutral. Her skin, hidden beneath the cloak, remained mostly out of sight. The second guard frowned. "Transmission's been acting up lately. But no one told me about this." She tried to keep the tremor out of her voice. "They told me to come here. Maybe the order was rushed. The manager's name is Mardek. He's in a foul mood. If I show up empty-handed..." She let the implication hang. Mercenary types often responded to fear of an angry boss. This was a gamble, but she had no choice. The guards exchanged glances, uncertain. One shrugged. "Let her check with the comm officer." Before the other could protest, they stepped aside, though not fully convinced. Zaira pushed through the door, ignoring the guard's lingering stare. Inside, the corridor was narrow, lined with heavy pipes. She heard footsteps behind, one of the guards following at a distance. Her pulse spiked. She continued forward, praying that Dane would handle the second guard. They passed the hatch leading into a small side room. She risked a quick glance inside, empty. She slipped in and pressed against the wall. The guard's footsteps approached. Breath held, she waited. As he passed the door, she lunged, striking fast. He barely had time to turn before she slammed him into the wall, hand clamped over his mouth. He struggled, eyes wide. She jammed a stun rod into his side, something she'd lifted from a crate outside. The guard convulsed and collapsed in a heap. She exhaled, heart pounding. Outside, she heard a muffled commotion. Likely Dane dealing with the other guard. She crouched, rummaging the unconscious guard's pockets. A keycard. Perfect. She eased back into the corridor. Dane joined her, leading with a tense nod. They exchanged no words. There was no time for conversation. Wordlessly, they continued upward into the tower, using the keycard to pass locked doors until they reached the control center. It was a cramped room filled with flickering monitors and a single occupant, a startled technician who leaped up at the sight of intruders. Before he could react, Dane subdued him with a swift blow. The technician crumpled unconscious. Zaira rushed to the console, scanning the unfamiliar system. With her knowledge of Imperial codes, she bypassed the basic encryption. This was a mercenary setup, not well fortified against advanced infiltration. She found the broadcast function, hastily inputting an old royal emergency frequency. Her heart thundered. If any loyalists were listening, this was their chance. She glanced at Dane, who watched the door, tension radiating from him. Without overthinking, she pressed the transmit button, speaking in her language. "This is Princess Zaira of House Lusser. The palace has fallen. If you hear this, respond immediately." They waited, the seconds stretching. Silence hissed over the speakers. Her stomach tightened with dread. Had no one survived? Then crackling static. A faint voice answered in the same tongue. "Highness. We read you, location?" Relief slammed into her so hard she nearly swayed. She glanced at Dane, who gave no sign of emotion, simply a nod for her to continue. She quickly relayed approximate coordinates, and requested a safe rendezvous. The voice on the other end confirmed that a small loyalist faction had retreated to a hidden fortress beyond the old mines. They provided coordinates. Her breath caught. The fortress was legendary, a last resort stronghold her father had built in secret. She thought it was only a myth. "Stay hidden," the voice said. "We will send a scout to guide you, but the insurgents are everywhere." Before she could respond, static surged, and the line went dead. Possibly jammed. She cursed, turning to Dane. "We have a meeting point. We can reach it in a day if we move fast." He nodded. "Then let's go." They left the tower, hearts hammering with urgency. Alarms started to ring as they made their escape, the mercenaries realizing something was amiss. They sprinted through the compound, weaving among startled workers and scowling guards. Several times, they had to duck behind crates or slip through side passages. At one point, a stray blaster bolt scorched the air by Zyra's ear, but they managed to evade a full-scale confrontation. Reaching the outer fence, they scrambled over barbed wire, tearing cloaks and scraping skin. No time to dwell on pain. Their stolen scout craft waited where they had hidden it. They rushed on board, sealed the hatch, and powered up. Engines roared, lifting them off the ground. A searchlight from the outpost tried to track them, but they were already pushing the thrusters to full. In minutes, they were out of range, the wind whipping past them as they flew toward the coordinates the loyalists had provided. Inside the cockpit, sweat dripped down Zyra's temples. Her injured leg throbbed, her every nerve alive with adrenaline. Dane sat beside her, posture taut. They didn't speak. The magnitude of what they'd accomplished weighed on them. They had the faintest glimmer of hope. If a loyalist faction still existed, she had a chance to reclaim what was lost. But that chance was fragile. And there was still the matter of Dane's personal vendetta, looming like a silent sword over her head. Night fell again, and they raced across the dark skies, heading toward the old mines. The journey took hours. She fought fatigue, eyes stinging, but refusal to fail propelled her forward. Eventually, they neared the location. The terrain below became rugged, pockmarked with abandoned excavation sites. She reduced altitude, skimming just above the surface to avoid detection. The onboard scanner pinged, picking up a single craft hovering ahead, lights off to stay hidden. A coded flash of signals confirmed it was the Loyalist scout. They followed the small vessel into a tunnel carved into a cliff face. Doors sealed behind them, shutting out the night. Inside, lights activated, revealing an enormous hidden hangar. Several battered ships stood in neat rows, along with a cadre of soldiers wearing the royal crest. Zyra's heart twisted at the sight of them. These were her father's men, her men, still standing, still loyal. She landed the craft, engines whining as they powered down. Dane rose from his seat, expression unreadable. Zyra took a steadying breath, mind churning with the implications. They had arrived. Surrounded by her people, she no longer needed him in the same way, or did she? The moment left her off balance, uncertain of her next move. The ramp lowered. Soldiers rushed forward, weapons trained, then lowered them upon recognizing her. A man with a graying beard stepped forward. "Princess Zyra," he said, voice trembling with emotion. "We feared the worst. Your father." She swallowed hard. "What of him?" The soldier's eyes fell. "He was captured. The insurgents, we do not know his fate." A sick wave of grief and fury threatened to overwhelm her. She swallowed it down, forcing her royal composure. "We will find him. We will restore this empire." She gestured to Dane. "This man aided my escape." The soldier eyed Dane with caution but said nothing. Another loyalist joined them, a tall woman with piercing eyes and the bearing of a seasoned commander. She bowed quickly to Zyra. "We have begun gathering what forces remain. Many are scattered, some beyond communication. We have only a fraction of the army." Zyra's gaze hardened. "Then we do not hesitate. We strike back where we can. We find my father. We retake the capital." She turned to include Dane in that statement, as though testing his reaction. He stood back, arms folded. The loyalists looked at him warily, uncertain how to treat this unknown human. He gave them that same cold, unflinching stare, not speaking. The tension was palpable. No one knew if he was friend or foe. Zyra herself wasn't certain. But she remembered the countless times he could have abandoned or harmed her. He hadn't. That alone was enough to grant him momentary trust, even if it was uneasy. For the next several hours, she conferred with the loyalists, absorbing updates, strategies, intelligence. Dane hovered on the periphery, occasionally asked questions by suspicious soldiers, but mostly left alone. Zyra threw herself into planning. She recognized that the situation was dire. The insurgents controlled the capital, had likely installed puppet leaders. Civilians were caught in the middle. Time was running out. She had to act, and she needed to maintain a united front. Each decision weighed heavily on her. But there, beneath the swirl of crisis, was a constant awareness of Dane, his quiet presence both reassuring and unsettling. When the meeting concluded, she limped out of the briefing chamber, mind spinning with possibilities. Dane was waiting in the corridor. She paused, regarding him. An odd pang of relief flickered through her. She might have expected him to vanish now that she was safely among her own. Yet he remained. "How does it feel?" he asked quietly. "To have your people look to you for hope, while you bear the knowledge that their empire might already be lost?" A flicker of anger ran through her, but she was too drained for an outburst. Instead, she murmured, "I will not abandon them. Or my father. If that's what you wanted to know." He nodded, almost thoughtful. "What's your next move?" She studied him. The question felt like a challenge, but also an invitation. He was waiting to see if she would cast him aside or draw him closer. She was painfully aware that she still needed him, not just as a soldier but as a shield against her own worst impulses. She hated how integral he felt to her plans. Yet she couldn't deny it. In a low voice, she said, "I've formed a strike team. We'll infiltrate the capital. Rescue my father if he's alive. We need every capable fighter we have." She let the implication hang. He met her gaze, unreadable. When he finally spoke, his tone was brisk, businesslike. "If it means finishing this war, I'm in." She swallowed, ignoring the heat in her stomach at his agreement. "Then get some rest. We leave at first light." Without waiting for his response, she turned on her heel, letting him watch her walk away. She refused to look back, though she sensed his eyes on her. It felt like a victory, though she wasn't sure for which side. The next morning, they gathered in the fortress's armory. Soldiers checked weapons, loaded gear into transports. Zyra dressed in combat leathers, a far cry from her royal gowns. The outfit was functional, hugging her lithe frame, allowing freedom of movement. She noticed Dane watching her, though when she met his eyes, he looked away. She pretended it didn't stir a flicker of satisfaction inside her. They boarded an armored shuttle. Tension crackled in the close quarters. 2 squads of loyalists accompanied them, faces set in grim determination. Dane took a seat near the hatch, adjusting the harness of his rifle. She sat across from him, arms folded, the faint swirl of color along her skin betraying her heightened state. In the hush, they locked gazes, a silent promise of confrontation or unity, perhaps both. The shuttle rumbled into motion, heading toward the capital. No one spoke. Everyone understood the risks. By the end of this day, the fate of the Empire could be decided. Zyra closed her eyes briefly, steadying her breath. The responsibility weighed on her, but ironically it also fueled her. She was a princess, trained for war as well as diplomacy. She would not falter. They soared over the devastated outskirts of the city. Smoke still curled from shattered buildings. The once grand gates lay in ruins, replaced by insurgent roadblocks and anti-air batteries. The pilot took them in low, weaving through side streets and canyons of rubble. The plan: infiltrate the royal district on foot, use hidden passages in the palace complex to reach the dungeons and rescue her father, then signal for backup. The shuttle landed in a deserted courtyard near a collapsed tower. Zyra led the way out, her heart thundering with each step. Dane flanked her, silent but vigilant. The squad spread out, scanning for patrols. Bits of debris clattered underfoot. The city felt like a ghost of its former self: burned-out vehicles, broken statues, streets coated in ash. The insurgents had erected barricades at major intersections, but this quiet zone seemed neglected. They approached an entrance to the old catacombs that ran beneath the royal district. A rusted grate barred the way. Zyra and Dane pried it open, the metal protesting loudly. One by one, the loyalists slipped into the darkness. She felt a wave of claustrophobia in the cramped tunnel, but forced herself to press on. Flickering lights and the hush of musty air heightened her nerves. Dane stayed close behind, matching her pace. The catacombs twisted, labyrinthine. Ancient stone corridors occasionally branched off into tombs of long-dead monarchs. Rats scurried. Water dripped. The tension was suffocating. Finally, they emerged into a section beneath the palace. Vaulted ceilings overhead indicated they were near the dungeons or sublevels. She raised a hand for silence. A patrol's footsteps echoed somewhere ahead. The squads took cover behind stone pillars. 2 insurgent guards appeared, scanning with flashlights. In perfect coordination, the loyalists ambushed them. Before they could raise alarms, the guards were incapacitated. It was a clean, silent operation. They advanced deeper into the palace's underbelly, hearts pounding. At last, they reached the dungeon area. A heavy steel door barred the corridor, manned by multiple guards. Zyra pressed herself against the wall, breathing shallowly. She sensed her father was beyond that door, if the rumors were correct. She gestured for the squads to split, flanking from both sides. Dane nodded, stepping to the left with 2 loyalists. She took the right, leading the others. They launched the assault. The corridor filled with the thunder of weapons fire and the crackle of energy blasts. The guards shouted in alarm, returning fire. Sparks ricocheted off stone walls, and the air reeked of ozone. Zyra's pulse hammered. She fired with cool precision, her jaw set. A guard fell. Another rushed forward, weapon blazing. Dane tackled him from behind, slamming him into the wall with brutal force. Within minutes, the guards were neutralized. The battered steel door still stood, locked tight. Zyra's squads quickly placed charges. She retreated behind a pillar. A dull explosion rocked the corridor, blowing the door off its hinges. Smoke billowed. They surged forward into the dungeons, weapons at the ready. Cells lined the walls, cramped spaces of filth and despair. She felt her gut twist at the sight of half-starved prisoners. Loyalists rushed to free them, calling out names, searching. Zyra pushed past, heading for the largest cell at the far end. Her breath caught. Through the bars, she saw a figure slumped on the ground, regal robes tattered. "Father," she whispered. The occupant stirred weakly. His face was gaunt, bruised. But when he lifted his gaze, recognition flared. He crawled forward. "Zyra! You're alive!" She shot the lock, the cell door squealing open. Rushing in, she knelt by his side, voice trembling with rare emotion. "I'm here. I'm going to get you out." He nodded weakly, coughing. His once proud shoulders sagged under the weight of imprisonment. She felt fury coil in her chest. This man, once the unyielding ruler of an empire, reduced to captivity. She helped him to his feet, supporting him with an arm around his waist. Dane appeared at the cell entrance, expression shadowed. He took in the sight of her father, the man who had ordered the destruction of his unit. There was a moment of taut silence, but he said nothing. Instead, he moved to help, half carrying the Emperor's weight when Zyra's strength flagged. She shot him a glare. Was he truly going to help the man he hated? But the chaos left no time for questions. They hurried back toward the corridor. The rescued prisoners followed, some limping, some carried by loyalists. Alarms blared. Insurgent reinforcements would be closing in fast. Zyra's father managed to whisper. "The palace, the council chambers, they are occupied by traitors. We must." She cut him off gently. "We will deal with them. But first, we get you to safety." He nodded, though a flicker of sorrow crossed his features. There was no time to comfort him. Gunfire echoed from the catacombs ahead. The squads that had secured their approach now faced incoming insurgent forces. Zyra's team braced themselves, fear pulsing in her veins. They were trapped, forced to fight their way out. The corridor erupted in a pitched battle. Energy blasts lit the gloom. Shouts and screams reverberated. The stench of burnt flesh and metal hung in the air. Zyra fought with grim determination, pulses of color racing across her skin as adrenaline soared. Each shot she fired was fueled by a deep, visceral rage at the betrayal her family had suffered. Across the melee, she caught glimpses of Dane. He moved like a specter of death, taking down insurgents with ruthless efficiency. Their eyes met briefly over the chaos. A surge of raw energy passed between them, as if they were bound by a shared fate. Her father clung to consciousness, shielded by loyalists who formed a protective ring. One by one, the insurgents fell, or retreated, until the corridor was thick with smoke and the moans of the wounded. When the dust settled, Zyra's squads regrouped. The cost was high. Several loyalists lay dead. She swallowed her grief, focusing on the living. They had the Emperor, battered but breathing. Victory seemed within reach, yet the echoes of conflict resonated through the palace. More insurgents would arrive. Soon. Hurry! She barked, spurring the survivors forward. We have to exit through the tunnels. They retraced their steps, burdened by the injured, hearts hammering. The catacombs were choked with dust. She prayed they could slip away before reinforcements pinned them down. Dane brought up the rear, checking behind them, covering their flank. She felt a rush of gratitude and confusion. He was still fighting for her, or perhaps just for his own ends. But in this moment, that distinction didn't matter. They emerged into the city's crumbled outskirts. The sun was high, glaring off the rubble. They had to move quickly to the rendezvous where their shuttle waited in camouflage. With grim determination, they pressed onward, using side streets and ruined structures for cover. The group slogged through the devastation, occasionally pausing to catch their breath. Zyra's father leaned heavily on her, but she refused to let him fall. An hour later, they reached the shuttle's location. Loyalists formed a defensive perimeter while Zyra led her father aboard. The pilot fired up the engines. Relief coursed through her, but it was tempered by the knowledge that the fight was far from over. She settled her father on a bench, pressing a water flask to his lips. He drank slowly, eyes clouded with pain. Dane remained near the hatch, scanning the sky for threats. As the shuttle lifted off, Zyra sank into a seat across from her father, exhaustion claiming her. She locked eyes with him, emotions swirling in the space between them. At last, she spoke, voice barely above a whisper. I thought I'd lost you. He tried to smile, though it wavered. You have your mother's strength, child. I knew you would survive. Her throat tightened. She took his hand, swallowing hard. A moment of vulnerability passed, unguarded. Then her gaze shifted to Dane. He stood at the hatch, the wind ruffling his hair, face set in stoic concentration. She sensed an undercurrent of tension in his posture. The circle was now complete. He'd rescued the man he once sought to destroy. She wondered if this changed his vendetta. Later, when they arrived back at the hidden fortress, medics rushed to tend the Emperor. The wounded were shuffled to an infirmary. Zyra oversaw everything, giving orders with a regal composure that belied her frayed nerves. Soldiers bowed as she passed. Whispers spread like wildfire. The princess had returned with the Emperor in tow. Hope stirred in the fortress. They had a leader again. Dane slipped away from the commotion, preferring the shadows. Only when Zyra finished ensuring her father's care did she notice his absence. Impulsively, she followed a hunch that he'd gone to one of the deserted corridors. She found him near a storage bay, leaning against the wall, arms folded. A scowl darkened his features. Without preamble, she approached. So it ends here? She demanded softly. You've seen him. Your revenge. He turned, eyes flashing. I'm not done yet. She lifted her chin. You saved his life. He gave a mirthless laugh. Maybe I did. Or maybe I just wanted to see him punished properly. This was bigger than I realized. If the insurgents take over, my vengeance means nothing. So I'll stick around until I'm certain which side is worth winning. She stepped closer, a dangerous tension radiating between them. You question whether to side with me or them? He didn't flinch. I question everything. Then, more quietly. But you fight for something I can almost respect. A heated retort rose to her lips, but she couldn't force it out. Instead, she let that tension stretch, air crackling. She realized how close they stood, the subtle interplay of breath and physical awareness that had been building. A war raged inside her, part of her wanted to challenge him, dominate him, force him to bend. Another part felt a pull, a twisted attraction that refused to be silenced. She hissed, half in anger, half in something else. You continue to test me. He smirked, that infuriating curve of lips. Someone has to. Her skin flared a subtle blue along the edges of her neck, an involuntary flush. She hated that he saw it. She spun on her heel, forcing distance. I have to see to the final stand, she said, voice tight. We plan to strike the insurgent stronghold in 2 days. Rest while you can. Without another word, she stalked away, leaving him in the dim corridor. The pounding of her heart drowned out all other noise. She told herself it was fury that made her pulse race. She told herself it was exhaustion that made her breath uneven. But deep down, she knew better. The human was inside her head. She tried to bury that realization under thoughts of war. The following day, preparations for the final battle consumed every waking moment. Soldiers drilled, alliances were confirmed, supplies loaded. The Emperor, though weak, insisted on addressing the troops. His voice, though raspy, rallied morale. Zyra stood beside him, her presence a silent vow that the royal line still held power. Dane lingered on the outskirts, half part of the group, half outsider, always watching. As night fell, the fortress quieted with tense anticipation. Soon, they would assault the insurgent stronghold. The entire war would pivot on that clash. In her private chamber, really a converted office, Zyra removed her combat gear, rolling her shoulders to release tension. Bruises and cuts marred her limbs, but she had no time for vanity. She leaned over a small basin, splashing water on her face, trying to clear her mind. A subtle movement behind her made her spin, hand going to a blade at her waist. Dane stood in the doorway, silent as a wraith. She glared. Do you ever knock? He shrugged. You left the door unguarded. She snorted. Why are you here? He stepped inside, letting the door slide shut behind him. Her quarters were cramped and Spartan, a narrow bed, a desk stacked with data pads, a single glowing lamp. In that confined space, his presence felt overwhelming. The tension pressed down like a weight on her chest. I have questions, he said simply. She arched a brow. Then ask? He paused, searching her eyes. What happens if you win? Your father's empire, your throne, does it go back to the old ways? Her breath caught. She thought of the colonies, the oppression, the rebellions that had sparked this war. She felt a pang of guilt mixed with pride. I will do what I must to preserve order. But I won't repeat his mistakes. She lifted her chin, glaring defensively. Is that sufficient? He closed the distance between them, stopping just short of contact. She refused to retreat, though her heart thundered. His gaze was so intense, she felt it like a physical force. I've lost too many friends to your father's empire. I came here wanting to end it, or at least him. Now I'm not sure. Silence stretched, thick as smoke. She saw the conflict in his eyes, reflecting her own tangled feelings. Neither could deny the draw that had been building between them, the furious, combative attraction that simmered whenever they locked horns. She swallowed, feeling warmth flood her veins despite herself. He lifted a hand, brushed it lightly against her cheek. She tensed, uncertain whether to attack or yield. The moment bristled. She slapped his hand away, but it wasn't a full rejection. More like a challenge. A dare. Her breath came faster. Don't assume you can just. He gripped her arms, pressing her back against the wall, eyes blazing with that cold fire. She snarled, muscles coiling to fight him off. But the moment he tightened his hold, something in her traitorous body responded, a surge of heat that left her dizzy. She drew a shaky breath, scowling in defiance. Their eyes locked, breath mingling in the tense space. Do it, she hissed. Fight me. That's all you know, isn't it? His lips curled in a grim smile. You don't want a gentle lover, do you, princess? She parted her lips to hurl an insult, but no words came. Her heart pounded so hard she tasted blood. She shoved him back, but he resisted, foot braced against the floor, forcing her in place. Anger flashed in her eyes, and she twisted her body, reversing the pin. Now he was the one against the wall, her forearm pressed to his throat. He didn't resist, just locked gazes with her, a challenge blazing in every fiber. Heat coiled in her belly, rage and desire merging. She pressed closer, feeling the hard planes of his chest. The tension between them was a live wire, snapping. With a low growl, she crushed her mouth against his, an assault rather than a kiss. It was savage, fueled by hatred, frustration, and something dangerously close to need. He made a sound deep in his throat, arms coming up to grab her waist, pulling her body flush to his. She tensed, torn between battling him and giving in to the electric surge coursing through her nerves. When they finally broke apart, panting, they stared at each other in shock. Her lips throbbed, bruised from the force of that clashing kiss. She saw his chest rise and fall, heard the ragged edge to his breathing. A fierce hunger pulsed in the space between them, overshadowing the animosity that had once defined them. She swallowed, trying to regain composure. "This changes nothing," she rasped. "I still." He silenced her with another bruising kiss, equally violent, equally desperate. Her mind spun. She shoved him away. He stumbled a step, eyes ablaze. She touched her swollen lips, her skin flushed with color. The sense of losing control ignited a wild fury. She lunged, hooking a leg behind his, forcing him off balance. They tumbled onto the narrow bed, limbs tangling. He rolled on top, pinning her wrists. She bucked under him, teeth bared. They stayed that way, trembling with adrenaline, eyes locked. Slowly, the violence ebbed, replaced by a thick, tangible ache of longing. She recognized that same conflict in his gaze, the push and pull between revenge and surrender. She hated him for making her feel this. She hated herself for wanting it. Her breath hitched. He spoke, voice low. "You want me to leave?" She glared, eyes fierce, no real answer escaping her lips. Instead, she lifted her head, meeting his mouth again, though this time the kiss was slower, deeper. The anger still simmered, but it merged with a desperate hunger. Their hearts pounded as they tested each other with teeth and tongue, each refusing to be the first to soften. Hands roamed, discovering scars and bruises, forging an intimacy that was more battle than embrace. At some point, she managed to push him onto his back, climbing over him, triumphant in that fleeting moment of dominance. He let out a low, rough laugh, gripping her hips, guiding her with a fierce challenge in his eyes. The tension was thick, almost unbearable. Neither gave quarter, the entire act a contest of wills. It wasn't gentle, nor was it precisely hateful. It was raw, primal, the release of pent-up fury and attraction in equal measure. In that frantic tangle, they lost track of time. Armor straps were unclasped, sleeves shoved aside, uniforms half-torn. Their skins slid together, slick with sweat, each breath a ragged moan or growl. She felt his heart hammering as if it might burst. Her nails bit into his shoulders, leaving marks. He gasped against her neck, hands knotting in her hair. It was a clash, a surrender, a conflagration of everything they'd denied. When the intensity finally crested, they both tensed, a shock of shared pleasure tearing through them like lightning. She threw her head back, a strangled cry catching in her throat, while his grip tightened, muscles taut as cables. For a moment, time snapped into focus. Her senses acutely aware of the bed, the smell of dust and sweat, the hum of the fortress sliding. Then it all dissolved in a wave that left her trembling. They collapsed in a breathless heap, the air thick with the aftermath. She lay there, heart racing, chest rising and falling against his. Neither spoke, as if words would shatter the fragile bubble of silence. She stared at the ceiling, the faint lights flickering across her vision. Gradually, the tension in her muscles began to ease. She felt his body warm against hers, the slow descent from that dizzying high. Eventually, he rolled onto his side, propping himself on an elbow. She turned her head, meeting his gaze. It was a raw moment, stripped of the usual masks. They stared at each other, both too drained to posture. She felt an unexpected vulnerability, and the realization rattled her. She tried to steel herself, but exhaustion dulled her defenses. His voice, quiet, broke the hush. "I should go. A hollow ache spread in her chest. She nodded, not trusting her voice. He disentangled himself, gathering what remained of his clothes. She watched him move, the play of muscles. It stirred a pang of lingering desire, but also a fresh wave of confusion. When he was dressed, he looked back at her. She held his gaze, heart pounding, but neither said anything else. Then he stepped out, leaving her in the aftermath of the storm they'd unleashed. She lay still for a long time, grappling with what had happened. Anger, shame, and a strange satisfaction warred in her mind. She had crossed a line with an enemy she didn't fully trust. She also felt a sense of inevitability, as though this was the only path they could have taken. Eventually, she forced herself to get up. There was still a battle to fight. Morning arrived with tension so thick it could be tasted in the air. The fortress bustled with final preparations. Zaira donned her battle gear, ignoring the soreness in her muscles. She kept her face impassive, refusing to acknowledge the swirling turmoil inside her. When she stepped into the main hangar, Dane was already there, doing a final check on his weapons. Their eyes met for the briefest moment. A flicker of acknowledgement. Nothing more. The Emperor, though weak, insisted on being present to see them off. He thanked the assembled troops, voice cracking but determined. Zaira stood at his side, chin high. She spotted Dane in the crowd, an unreadable expression on his face. Part of her despised how her pulse quickened. She forced herself to focus on the mission. Moments later, they boarded dropships, heading out in a coordinated strike. Their target, the insurgent stronghold, a fortress at the heart of the capital's government district. Intelligence suggested the insurgent leadership was gathered there, planning to consolidate power. If Zaira's forces could disrupt that meeting and capture key figures, the Empire might be saved. If they failed, the war would be lost. Gunmetal clouds obscured the sky as the dropships flew in low. Anti-air defenses fired sporadically, bright streaks across the gloom. Zaira braced herself, adrenaline surging. The pilot wove through the city's battered skyline, dodging blasts. At last, they set down in a courtyard near the stronghold's western gate. The gate soared overhead, flanked by imposing walls. Insurgent banners fluttered in the wind, a mocking statement that they owned this territory now. The squads deployed, fanning out under covering fire. Zaira took the lead, scanning for threats. Dane moved at her side, wordless but in sync. They advanced to rubble-strewn alleys, exchanging bursts of blaster fire with insurgent patrols. The roar of conflict engulfed them. Smoke stung her eyes. She barked orders to her squads, each step bringing them closer to the fortress walls. An explosion tore a building facade apart, raining debris. Zaira shielded her face, cursing. Through the dust, she saw a group of insurgents retreat inside a gatehouse. She signaled to two squads, who sprinted forward, launching grenades. The gatehouse erupted, clearing the path to the fortress courtyard. Soldiers surged in, engaging the defenders. Bodies fell, screams echoed, and the air thickened with the acrid smell of burnt flesh and metal. Zaira's focus narrowed. She felt the electric charge of battle, heart hammering with near-painful intensity. She fired relentlessly, each shot guided by her will to reclaim her kingdom. Dane matched her stride, cutting down foes with lethal efficiency. There was a savage poetry to the way they fought side by side, either overshadowing the other, each complementing the other's ferocity. Finally, they breached the inner courtyard, where the insurgent leadership was rumored to be meeting. The architecture was a mockery of her father's style, banners replaced with insignias of the uprising. A swirling melee erupted, loyalists clashing with entrenched insurgent guards. Zaira took cover behind a fallen statue, reloading her weapon. Dane crouched next to her, blood trickling down his forehead from a gash, though he barely seemed to notice. He glanced at her, breath ragged. "We need to push through. They're holed up in that council chamber." She nodded, ignoring the jolt of concern she felt at his injury. Summoning every ounce of resolve, she rallied her troops, launching a final charge across open ground. Blaster fire sizzled, cutting down friend and foe alike. Every step was a razor's edge, the line between life and death. She reached the chamber's grand doors, scorched from the battle, and unleashed a volley that shattered the lock. Loyalists followed, storming inside. Chaos reigned in the chamber. Several insurgent officers scrambled for cover, returning fire. The place was a swirl of shouting bodies and frantic energy blasts. Zyra aimed at a tall figure in ornate insurgent garb, likely a leader. Her shot seared his armor, sending him sprawling. Dane tackled another who tried to flank them, slamming him to the floor with brutal force. When the dust settled, the insurgent officers lay defeated. Loyalists rounded them up, restraining those still alive. A hush fell in the chamber, punctuated by the crackle of flames and the groans of the wounded. Zyra stood among the wreckage, chest heaving. She had done it. The insurgent leadership was broken. The capital was in her grasp. But at a terrible cost. Soldiers cheered in weary triumph, some sinking to their knees in relief. Zyra lowered her weapon, feeling an odd numbness. All around, Loyalists rushed to secure the perimeter, remove bodies, and tend to the wounded. She allowed herself a single moment of raw emotion, leaning against a pillar for support. Then she lifted her head, casting her gaze over the chamber. Dane emerged from behind an overturned table, dusting himself off. A bruise darkened his jaw, and blood still trickled from the cut on his forehead. Their eyes met, and a silent understanding passed between them. They had fought as enemies, but ended up fighting side by side in a war bigger than their personal vendettas. Something had shifted irreversibly. She stepped toward him, ignoring the stares of her soldiers. Her chest rose and fell, adrenaline still coursing. He inclined his head slightly, as though acknowledging her victory. But she caught the flicker of conflict in his eyes. She reached out, pressing her palm gently against the gash on his brow. He tensed, unused to gentle contact, but didn't pull away. In a hushed voice, she said, "We'll get that cleaned up." A short laugh escaped him, laced with exhaustion. "You've got bigger things to worry about, Princess." She shook her head, ignoring the swirl of color that threatened to flare on her cheeks. "Not at the moment." He held her gaze, and for the first time, she saw something like acceptance there. Not submission, not surrender, but a quiet acknowledgement that they had transcended the roles that once bound them. Around them, the Loyalists and newly captured insurgents moved in a flurry of activity, but in that instant, it felt as though the world narrowed to just the two of them. Word arrived that the last pockets of resistance in the city were collapsing. The Loyalists had retaken key structures. The Empire, at least in its capital, was under royal control once more. Over the next hours, the chaotic aftermath unfolded, prisoners processed, security details established, medical teams dispatched. Zyra took command, orchestrating the reconstruction of order. Her father, still weak, was moved to a secure location, but he insisted on witnessing the rebel leaders stand trial. Throughout the frenzy, Dane stayed near, assisting where he could, never quite blending with either the Loyalists or the new detainees. He was an anomaly, and she was grateful for it. Late that night, she found him outside the battered remains of the council chamber, leaning against a broken pillar. He looked up as she approached. "It's done, isn't it?" he asked, his voice low. She lifted her eyes to the star-filled sky, the city lights flickering beneath the scars of war. "Not entirely. But we're on the path." She paused, then turned to him. "What will you do now?" He was silent for a long moment. "I came here seeking vengeance. I don't know if I found it. Your father still lives. Your empire still stands. But," he exhaled, almost a sigh, "maybe that's not what I truly wanted." She studied his face. "Then stay," she offered quietly, surprising even herself with the words. "Help us rebuild. Help me ensure that the mistakes of the past aren't repeated." He regarded her, eyes searching. "You still trust me after everything?" A wry smile curved her lips. "You saved my life more times than I can count. You helped free my father. And you and I have unfinished business." Her voice caught subtly on that last phrase, memory of their shared night flickering through her mind. He let out a soft, disbelieving breath. Then, with something that resembled genuine warmth, he said, All right, princess. I'll stay. She felt a flood of relief, though she kept her composure. Good, she said briskly, turning away. We have much to do. Before she could take more than a few steps, he caught her hand, turning her back to face him. She froze, breath catching. He didn't pull her into an embrace or offer a kiss. Instead, he simply gazed at her with a solemn expression. She understood the gesture well enough. A new beginning, either slave nor conqueror, either just a servant nor a princess. Equals in the aftermath of war, bound by a bond they'd forged in conflict. She squeezed his hand, her own brand of acknowledgement. Then they separated, each returning to their duties. But the glances they exchanged through the night's work spoke volumes. No longer mortal enemies, no longer master and servant. Something unspoken connected them, fragile, potent, and real. Days turned into weeks. The city slowly regained stability. Loyalist forces spread out across the planet, re-establishing order, though not with the same iron fist as before. The Emperor, recovering under medical care, granted more responsibilities to Zyra. She took them on with determination, forging alliances with once hostile colonies, vowing to reshape the empire into a realm less defined by oppression and more by mutual benefit. Dane found a place among her newly formed elite guard, an ironic twist that amused some and angered others. He didn't care about their whispers. He operated with ruthless efficiency, rooting out insurgent remnants, ensuring peace. Their interactions were still rife with tension, but it had shifted to a different kind, one laced with mutual respect and an undercurrent of something undeniably personal. The final confrontation came when her father, once fully conscious, summoned both Zyra and Dane to a private chamber. They arrived uncertain. The Emperor sat in regal robes, though his gaunt features showed the toll of imprisonment. He regarded Dane with ice in his eyes. "I am told you were once my enemy," he said. Dane stood rigid, saying nothing. Zyra hovered by his side, heart pounding. She couldn't deny her father's right to question or punish. But she also knew how much they owed Dane. "Yes, father," she said softly. "He was an infiltrator, seeking revenge for his fallen comrades in the outer colonies." She held her father's gaze. "But he saved my life and yours. We would not be here without him." A tense silence followed. The Emperor's eyes flicked between them, as though discerning a deeper bond. "So I owe you a debt, human. That is not comfortable for me to admit." Dane's lips parted, but no words came. The Emperor exhaled heavily. "For my daughter's sake, and for the Empire, I choose not to repay you with death. You may remain if that is your wish." Zyra felt tension drain from her limbs. Dane inclined his head, offering a silent acceptance. He didn't ask for more. He didn't expect a grand gesture. The Emperor's grudging acknowledgement was enough. After that meeting, the boundaries had shifted once again. A month passed. The battered capital city showed signs of renewal. Citizens emerged from hiding, commerce resumed. Through painstaking efforts, Zyra's reforms took shape. She faced resistance from entrenched loyalists who clung to the old ways, but she pushed forward, determined to learn from her father's mistakes. Dane became her silent sentinel, as much an enforcer as an advisor. They rarely spoke of their past or that night in the fortress. Yet the magnetism that simmered beneath the surface had not vanished. It lurked, waiting for a spark. On the eve of a new treaty signing, one that welcomed representatives from the once rebellious colonies, Zyra found Dane alone in the old palace courtyard. Twilight had fallen, stars reflected in the repaired glass panels overhead. He stood amid newly planted greenery, the scent of flowers wafting on the cool air. She approached quietly, heart skipping at the sight of him in formal attire, the angular lines of his face gentled by the soft light. She took a breath. "You missed the preparations in the hall." He glanced over, expression inscrutable. "Crowds and ceremony aren't really my style." She allowed a small smile. "Nor mine. Not anymore." Silence drifted between them, warm and filled with unspoken words. At last, she cleared her throat. "You've helped me rebuild. We're on the brink of something new. Once this treaty is signed, The Empire will never be the same. He nodded. That was the idea, wasn't it? Yes, she murmured, studying him. What about you? Will you remain once peace is established? He shifted his weight, gaze wandering to the star-flecked sky. I have no home left in the colonies. My friends are gone. I suppose I could drift, find mercenary work. But… He paused, then turned to face her, eyes piercing. You're here. She felt her throat tighten. I'm here, she echoed softly. Another hush enveloped them. In that quiet, they came to an unspoken understanding. She stepped closer, bridging the remaining distance. He rested a hand lightly on her hip, not an act of conquest but a gesture of acceptance. Her breath caught, remembering the violence of their first clash, the savage tension that once defined them. Now, standing in the courtyard under gentle starlight, the air around them felt charged with a different kind of electricity. She lifted her hand, touching the scar on his temple, the one earned in the final battle. He didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned into her touch. The sincerity of that moment rattled her. She recognized the vulnerability in it. A month ago, they would have fought to conceal such a thing. Tonight they allowed it. I won't make promises I can't keep, she said quietly. This empire still has a long road ahead. We'll face more battles, more struggles. I know, he said. And I'll fight those battles with you. If you'll have me. Her heart thundered. She nodded, swallowing against a knot in her throat. Yes. I will. He exhaled, a slow release of tension that seemed to linger from the very first day they met. She stepped closer, sliding her arms around him. This time, their kiss was gentle, a stark contrast to the bruising intensity of the fortress. Their lips met with a softness that spoke of hope rather than anger, acceptance rather than conquest. She felt his arms tighten around her, and for the first time, she let herself believe in a future that extended beyond war and vengeance. When they finally parted, she saw reflection of her own emotions in his eyes. A deep, abiding respect, tempered by the memory of all they'd survived. They stood there, two former enemies who had forged something unbreakable in the crucible of conflict. The courtyard lights cast dancing patterns on their skin. Neither spoke. They didn't have to. In the silence, they'd found the moment of truth. The next day, they signed the treaty. Representatives from across the territories gathered in the newly restored council hall. The emperor, still frail, looked on proudly as Zyra affixed her royal seal. Applause broke out, though some withheld, uncertain. Change, after all, was never easy. But the process had begun, and with it, a new era for the empire. After the ceremony, Zyra and Dane slipped away from the crowd. They stood on a balcony overlooking the city. Reconstruction crews labored below, scaffolding rising around partially collapsed buildings. The skies were dotted with cargo ships delivering supplies. A scene of rebirth, shaped by the sweat and determination of countless individuals who refused to give up. Dane leaned against the railing, arms folded. She joined him, letting the breeze whip her hair across her face. Warmth spread in her chest as she stared at the horizon. Everything felt different now, fragile, hopeful, and decidedly real. She turned to him, voice low. I don't know what the future holds. But for tonight we've won. He looked at her, a subtle smile curving his lips. That's enough. She rested her hand on his forearm. He placed his hand over hers. Their gazes locked, the memory of war and tension replaced by a quiet sense of unity. In that final moment, no words were needed to affirm what they'd become. They were two warriors shaped by conflict, bound by desire, and committed to forging a better world together. And so it ended, not with the clash of swords or the roar of blaster fire, but with the promise of a new beginning. They stood side by side, overlooking an empire on the mend, their hearts no longer fueled by hatred but by the kind of love that can only be born in the fires of war. A love that was once unthinkable, but had become inevitable, and unbreakable, in the end.